This happened back in the fall of 2017 in rural Ohio. My wife Emily and I had spent the previous 5 years scraping together every dollar we had to buy a small farmhouse just outside a tiny quiet town called Hollow Creek. We were tired of the city, the constant hum of traffic, the cramped apartments, and the total lack of privacy. We wanted a place where we could breathe, somewhere peaceful where the closest neighbor was a mile down a gravel road. For about the first year, it was exactly the paradise we had imagined. The property was beautiful, surrounded by dense woods on 2 sides and a massive, rolling cornfield on the other. Our daily routine became comforting in its simplicity. I would spend my mornings working on the property, Emily would commute to her job in the next town over, and our farmhand Jake would manage the fields. Jake had worked for my family for years before we bought this place. He was a deeply practical, no-nonsense guy in his late 40s, the kind of man who didn't get shaken by anything. He was quiet, reliable, and completely grounded in reality. But everything changed on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. I was sitting in the kitchen fixing a cup of coffee when my phone rang. It was Jake. The moment I answered, I knew something was wrong. His voice wasn't its usual calm, steady tone. It was low, tense, and incredibly strained. "Daniel?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I think somebody's watching me." Hearing fear in Jake's voice immediately got my attention. He explained that for the past 3 days while working near the edge of the cornfield, he felt an overwhelming weight on the back of his neck. When he turned around, he kept seeing a figure standing just inside the tree line. Just standing there, perfectly still, watching him. Jake told me that every time he tried to walk toward the woods to confront whoever it was, the figure would simply step backward into the thick brush and vanish without a sound. I tried to rationalize it. I assumed it was just a trespasser, maybe a hunter looking for deer, or some local kids from town messing around where they shouldn't be. I told Jake to head home early and promised him that Emily and I would drive out to the farm first thing the next morning to check things out. When we arrived the following day, a strange, heavy atmosphere hung over the entire property. The usual comforting silence of the countryside felt different, unusually quiet, almost suffocating. There were no birds singing, no rustling in the trees. Just a dead, heavy stillness. Jake was waiting for us by the barn. He looked terrible. He was pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and he looked like he hadn't slept a single wink. When he saw us pull up, he didn't even say hello. He just walked up to my car window, leaned in, and whispered something that sent a freezing chill straight down my spine. "He's here right now, Daniel." I immediately looked around. I scanned the empty yard, the open barn doors, the edge of the porch. Nothing. The property was completely empty. Jake pointed a trembling finger toward the side of the house. Then a second later he pointed toward the woods. Then toward the open field. "He keeps moving," Jake said, his eyes darting frantically across the landscape. "Every time I look away for just a second, he's in a different spot." To make matters worse, that same night, a scheduled regional power outage was set to take place for maintenance on the local grid. At exactly 9 p.m. the grid went dead. The entire property instantly disappeared into a pitch-black, suffocating darkness. Without the single floodlight on our barn, there was absolutely no ambient light. No streetlights, no glow from a nearby town, nothing but miles of empty, dark countryside. Around 10 p.m., Emily and I were sitting in our bedroom, trying to read by the dim glow of a battery-powered lantern. That's when we heard it. Crunch. It was a faint, distinct sound outside our first-floor bedroom window. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the dead leaves. Crunch, crunch. My heart hammered against my ribs. The footsteps paused, stopping directly beneath our window. I gripped my heavy flashlight, crept over to the window, and gently parted the blinds. I peered out into the blackness. Nothing. I clicked the flashlight on and swept the beam across the yard. The light cut through the dark, illuminating the grass, but revealed no one. Then, just as I was about to turn the light off, my breath caught in my throat. Just beyond the very edge of the flashlight's reach, right where the light faded into blackness, I saw it. A pale, completely motionless human face. It was just standing there in the dark, staring directly up at our window. The exact second the full beam of my flashlight hit the face, the figure darted backward into the shadows and completely disappeared. Jake was so terrified by the atmosphere that he refused to sleep inside the house with us that night. He insisted on locking himself inside the secure tool room in the barn. Around midnight, Emily and I were lying wide awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, too terrified to close our eyes. The house was dead silent, save for the creaking of the old wood adjusting to the cold night air. But then a new sound cut through the quiet. It was the faint, muffled sound of laughter, and it was coming from directly upstairs. The problem was, nobody was supposed to be upstairs. The second floor was just an unfinished attic space we used for storage. My hands shook as I grabbed the flashlight again. Leaving Emily in the bedroom with the door locked, I crept out into the hallway. I checked every room on the main floor. Nothing. Everything was exactly where it belonged. Then I turned the corner and looked up. The wooden attic hatch in the ceiling was standing wide open. A square of pure, absolute blackness yawned above me. I was almost certain that hatch had been firmly closed earlier that evening. As I stood directly beneath the dark opening, holding my breath, I heard it. A sound that made my blood run entirely cold. It was the sound of heavy, distinct breathing coming from the darkness right above me. Someone was up there, sitting right at the edge of the hatch, looking down at me. I didn't hesitate. I ran back to the bedroom, locked the door behind me, and immediately called the sheriff's department. It took the deputies until 2 a.m. to finally navigate the dark country roads and arrive at our house. With their flashlights drawn and guns unholstered, we walked up the narrow stairs together and searched the attic. What we found up there was worse than anything I could have ever imagined in my worst nightmares. Someone hadn't just broken in. Someone had been living up there. Tucked into the far corner of the dusty, low-ceilinged attic was a makeshift living space. There was a dirty twin mattress dragged from God knows where. Surrounding it were dozens of empty food containers, half-filled water bottles, several battery-powered lanterns, and piles of extra batteries. Whoever it was had turned our roof into their personal sanctuary. Then, one of the deputies shone his light on a small cardboard box sitting near the mattress. Inside were hundreds of photographs. I picked them up, my hands trembling violently. They were pictures of Emily. Pictures of me. Photos taken from the tree line while we ate dinner. Photos taken through the living room glass while we watched TV. Photos taken through our bedroom window while we were sound asleep. I flipped through them frantically until I found the oldest photo in the stack. It was dated 6 months prior. Someone had been living directly above our heads, secretly watching our entire lives for half a year. At the bottom of the box was a small notebook. I opened it to a random page. Every single page contained handwritten notes detailing our daily routines. Emily left for work at 7:12 a.m. Daniel spent 2 hours in the north field. They still haven't noticed me. Reading those cold, calculated words made me physically sick. Suddenly, a deafening, violent crash echoed from downstairs. The sound of splintering wood shattered the silence. Sheriff's Department. Freeze! The deputies yelled, rushing down the narrow attic stairs. We ran toward the noise, our flashlights bouncing wildly off the walls. When we reached the kitchen, the back door was standing wide open, swinging weakly on its hinges. Cold, bitter autumn air rushed into the house. Whoever had been hiding in our attic had been up there the entire time the police were searching, waiting for the perfect moment to slip down the back stairs and escape into the night. The sheriff's department searched the surrounding woods and cornfields for weeks. They brought in K-9 units, searched local records, and questioned neighbors. But they found absolutely nothing. No fingerprints left behind, no viable DNA, no suspects, and zero explanation for who the man was or why he was targeting us. Terrified for our safety, Emily and I sold the farmhouse at a massive financial loss just 3 months later. We packed up everything we owned and moved almost 200 miles away to a busy, well-lit suburban neighborhood. For a while, the ambient noise of the suburbs brought us comfort. Things finally started to feel normal again. Until Christmas morning arrived. I woke up early to make coffee. When I opened the front door to grab the morning paper, I froze. Sitting perfectly in the center of our welcome mat was a small brown paper package. There was no return address, no shipping label, no stamps, nothing. With a sinking feeling in my stomach, I tore the paper open. Inside was a single glossy photograph. It was a picture of our brand new suburban house, taken from the dark tree line of the woods directly behind our backyard. I flipped the photograph over. Written on the back in messy black ink were 5 words. I found you again. We called the police immediately, but just like before, there was nothing they could do. No footprints in the snow, no security footage that caught the drop-off. That was years ago. Since that morning, I've moved our family multiple times. I've changed my job, changed our phone numbers, and installed high-definition security cameras at every single angle of our current home. But every single Christmas morning before Emily or the kids wake up, I still walk down to the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. And I check the porch, just in case another package is waiting for me. Has anyone else ever discovered someone secretly living on their property? Because honestly, as the years go on, I'd rather believe it was a ghost than know a real person is still out there, somewhere in the dark, watching me. This happened back in the late fall of 2024. During a period of my life when the walls of my own home felt like they were slowly closing in on me. I was just tired of the arguments, I guess. The constant, grinding bickering that drove me to the absolute edge every single evening, followed by the suffocating silence of a dead bedroom. It ensured I'd never find release, and honestly, it wasn't even just in a sexual sense. I didn't crave sex, I craved the closeness. I wanted to feel wanted again. I didn't want pity touches or a dead routine. I wanted our spontaneity back. We got married young. I was 21 and she was 20. Back then, it was like she couldn't keep her hands off of me. But physical intimacy wasn't the core thing that brought us together. I truly did fall in love with her personality. We were able to talk for hours about absolutely nothing and everything at the same time. God, I miss those days. The world felt so much brighter back then, before the claws of constant proximity began to drive that slow, agonizing wedge between us. We had our honeymoon phase, spending our first year together in a small, cozy apartment. We could have filled entire scrapbooks with the genuine memories we made there, but instead, we just let those memories drift off in the wind, dying off with time. It wasn't long before the arguments started. A lot of them were about money. We were young, entirely on our own, and trying our best, but sometimes your best is just barely enough to scrape by. We also bickered about small, insignificant inconveniences, like leaving crumbs in the bed. Just petty things. But even then, we loved each other enough not to let the arguments define us. We'd still go out on dates and look like a genuinely happy couple out in public. We talk a lot during those times too. That's the main thing that gave me hope. We hadn't lost that innate ability to lose ourselves in conversation quite yet. Eventually, I managed to get a major promotion at work. I started making more money to keep the lights on, and my wife seemed legitimately proud of me. That didn't stop the arguments though. With my promotion, I found myself spending grueling 12-hour days at distant job sites, and that became the main thing she griped about. I'd kiss her on the forehead in the morning and maybe be home in time for a quick goodnight kiss if I was lucky. That's when things completely fell apart in the bedroom. If I were in the mood, she'd be fast asleep. If she were in the mood, I'd be too physically exhausted to engage. In the 9 years that followed, I watched my marriage fall apart little by little. We lost touch in every single sense of the word. But after a while of holding on to hope, it's hard not to feel completely numb. The idea of becoming totally indifferent to whether or not our marriage lasted was something that scared me tremendously. By our 9th anniversary, I knew something had to give. I managed to get the day off from work, and while she was at her job, I set up a beautiful picnic right in our living room. I put a video of a cozy, crackling fire on the TV, lit scented candles, prepared her absolute favorite food, and bought her favorite flowers from a specialty florist. All of that effort just for her to walk through the front door, look at me with dead eyes and hit me with a cold, "Oh my God, I'm so tired right now, I'm sorry, I can't do this." She breezed past me like I wasn't even there and stomped heavily up the stairs. All I felt was a crushing heartbreak as I packed up my corny little display and shoved the food into the fridge. I chose to sleep on the couch that night. I was up well into the early morning hours, tossing and turning. I wanted to go upstairs and demand an apology, but I was just so tired of starting conflicts. My hurt feelings would inevitably become my own fault in her eyes. Instead, I opted to scroll endlessly on my phone around 3 a.m. You know how sometimes it feels like your phone can hear the thoughts in your head, giving you ads for things you never even said out loud? That's exactly what happened. As I scrolled, I came across an ad that seemed eerily, specifically tailor-made for me. Do you feel like you've lost touch with your partner? Have the two of you grown apart? Click here to save your marriage with The Bridge. We bridge the gap in your marriage for a brighter tomorrow. First appointments are of no cost to you. It felt like fate. I clicked the link and scheduled an appointment for that coming Friday. Once I hit submit, it felt like a massive weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Before work the next morning, I shook my wife awake and told her what I had done. She objected furiously at first, and we went back and forth over text all day. It took an exhausting amount of convincing, but she finally reluctantly agreed. When the day arrived, we drove to the address listed. The office building was the cleanest, most sterile place I had ever seen. There were no chips in the concrete, no stains on the walls, and the parking lines were freshly, perfectly painted. When we walked into the lobby, the air was completely silent, smelling faintly of bleach. A receptionist sat behind a high counter. She smiled warmly and slid a clipboard across the counter with some paperwork. My wife crossed her arms and sighed, "You do it. This was your grand idea." As I sat in the plastic chair, I noticed the questions were weirdly personal, even for therapy. Rate your marital satisfaction. How frequently do you engage in physical intimacy? What are your primary relationship goals? I figured these were background notes, so I filled them out. We waited for what felt like ages in total silence. The waiting room was oddly empty. We were the only patients there. There were no magazines, no music playing. It just felt eerie. Suddenly, the heavy door to the back offices burst open. A tall man in a pristine white lab coat stepped through, introducing himself as the director. Before I could even stand up, he turned to my wife and asked to speak to her privately first to establish a baseline. She looked back at me, a sudden hint of nervousness flashing in her eyes as she was led into the back. The heavy door clicked shut, and the room fell into a dead silence. A few minutes went by, then 30 minutes, then an entire hour. I ended up waiting for another 2.5 hours. The silence was deafening. I could hear the faint humming of the fluorescent lights overhead, vibrating in my ears. Finally, the receptionist announced that the session had wrapped up. I breathed a massive sigh of relief, but the feeling was short-lived when she asked, "Will that be cash or card today?" I blinked, confused. The website explicitly said the first appointment was free. "The appointment is free," she replied, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "The operation itself will be about $3,000 even." My heart instantly fell into my stomach. Operation? What oper? Before I could finish, the heavy door swung open. My wife came through first, the doctor guiding her with his hands resting heavily on her shoulders. My breath caught in my throat. Her eyelids dangled low above her eyes like a broken porcelain doll. Her face was completely expressionless, entirely slack. Her jaw hung slightly open, and she moved with a rigid, unnatural zombie-like gait. The doctor saw my impending panic and quickly asked me to take a seat. He removed a small, sleek black remote control from his coat pocket and hit a button. Immediately, my wife's entire face lit up. She looked ecstatic, the happiest I'd seen her look in years. Her eyes snapped to mine with intense love as she came running at me. "Oh my gosh, I missed you," she sang, her voice pitched unnaturally high. She wrapped her arms tightly around my neck and buried her face deep into my chest. The doctor approached us slowly, a smug smile on his face. He pulled back the hair on the side of her head, right behind her ear. There, embedded flush against her skull, was a small, glowing metallic implant. "Neuralink," he announced proudly. "We fixed her. You can control how she feels at any point with this remote." He clicked another button. Suddenly, my wife's arms dropped from my neck like lead weights. Her shoulders slumped, and she began sobbing hysterically, tears streaming down her face. "I just love you and miss you so much," she choked out. "Please don't leave me." The doctor cocked his eyebrows at me, a chilling expression. "So, cash or card today, my friend?" What was I supposed to do? The operation was already done. Terrified of what they would do if I refused, I handed over my card and paid the $3,000. They handed me the remote in a small velvet pouch. It had multiple emotions clearly labeled: happiness, sadness, fear, anger, sleepy, calm. Out of a desperate, twisted curiosity, I kept her set to aroused for the car ride home. It was intoxicating at first. She was actually flirting with me like we were 20 again. But when we got home and had sex into the late hours of the night, it became unnerving. She wanted to continue even though I was completely tapped out, her eyes wide and staring, entirely unblinking. Panicking slightly, I pressed the button for sleepy. She just shut down mid-sentence, falling backward onto the pillows like she had been physically powered off. She was completely unresponsive, though she was still breathing. Feeling a deep, oily sense of guilt, I turned over and tried to go to sleep. The next morning, I picked up the remote and set her to calm. Her eyes groggily opened with a placid smile. "Good morning, my sweet pea," she yawned. Before I left for work, I pressed the happy button. All day, I received texts from her. "I'm so happy to have you. You're the best thing ever." When I got home, she was standing in the entryway with the biggest, widest smile, clapping her hands. "I'm so happy to see you. Tell me all about your day." From that moment on, she was completely in the palm of my hand. I made her cry during sad movies, or be angry alongside me when I complained about my boss. For a few weeks, I let myself believe we had been fixed. But as time went on, the horror of the situation began to slowly claw its way to the surface. Every single emotion she felt was built entirely around me. She never talked about herself, her own day at work, or her friends. It started to feel like I was trapped in a horrific living echo chamber. I called her office one afternoon, and her boss answered the phone. There was a long, uncomfortable pause when I identified myself. "So you're that husband she can't stop rambling on about," her boss said, his voice dropping to a low, suspicious tone. "It's all she talks about. It's a bit much." Then he handed the phone to my wife, who answered with a whimsical sing-song voice, "Hello, love of my lifey." A cold dread settled in my bones. That night, I sat her down and tested her across different emotions. "What's your favorite food?" I asked. "Whatever hubby is in the mood for," she chirped. I pressed anger. Her brow furrowed. "What makes you angry?" "When you're angry, obviously," she snapped. I realized I hadn't gotten my wife back. I had gotten a hollow, synthetic shell. I stopped playing with the buttons and just kept her permanently on happy or calm. I debated driving back to demand a reversal, but the sheer terror of what they might do to her brain stopped me. Finally, our 10th anniversary arrived. I came home from work near midnight. I unlocked the door, stepped into the dark hallway, and stopped. There she was, standing in the middle of our dim living room. She had set up a beautiful picnic blanket on the floor with my favorite food, wearing a wide, proud, unblinking smile. I was dog-tired, but looking at her standing there in the dark, I chose to humor her. I sat down heavily beside her, taking slow sips from my drink as she fired off a rapid, cheerful stream of robotic, affectionate words. The unnatural cheerfulness in the dark room was suffocating. The only thing that clawed its way to my mind was the single burning question that had been eating away at my soul for an entire year. "Honey," I whispered. "Yes, sweet love of my life," she beamed, leaning in close. I paused and finally found the twisted courage to speak. "Why do you love me?" She didn't flinch. Her wide, enthusiastic eyes didn't show even a single hint of real human processing. There was no memory recall, no genuine warmth. She just tilted her head, her smile stretching just a little too wide across her face in the shadows, and said, "Because you told me to, of course." It's been almost 2 years since that night. The remote still sits on my nightstand. I just leave her on a permanent loop of calm. But lately I've been staying up late, just watching her breathe in the dark. Sometimes I'll see her eyelids flutter violently, or I'll catch her body tensing up for a fraction of a second, as if she's trying to fight through the programming. And every single time I leave the house, I can't shake the terrifying feeling that someone else has a master controller, and that they're watching me from the shadows, waiting to see which button I'll press next. This happened back in the winter of 2018. I was 19 years old at the time, living in a quiet, suburban town where the streets emptied out long before midnight. It's funny how you never really notice the silence of a house until someone who used to fill it with life is suddenly gone. My mom's funeral had finally ended earlier that day. It was a blur of black clothing, polite whispers, and distant relatives offering hollow condolences that they forgot the moment they walked out the door. The last of them left just before sunset, and by midnight, the house had transitioned into an unbearably heavy, suffocating quiet. It wasn't a normal nighttime silence. It was the kind of thick, stagnant air that settles over a home after a long illness and an eventual death. She had been gone for 3 days, but the reality of it hadn't truly sunk in yet. I was sitting alone in my bedroom, the only light coming from the harsh glow of my phone screen. I wasn't even reading anything, I was just scrolling aimlessly, trying to numb my brain, desperately searching for any distraction to keep the grief from pulling me under. The heater would kick on occasionally, rattling the vents, but other than that, the house felt entirely dead. Then I smelled it. It was faint at first, a gentle draft carrying a very specific aroma through the crack beneath my bedroom door. My breath caught in my throat. It was the scent of warm walnut and honey pastries. It made absolutely no sense. My mom used to bake them every winter without fail. The smell was so distinct, so deeply tied to my childhood memories of her, that for a single delusional second, my brain completely bypassed reality. I actually thought she was downstairs in the kitchen, pulling a fresh tray out of the oven. The scent grew stronger, filling my room until it was overwhelming. In my mind, I could almost hear the walnuts crackling in the hot pan. I could almost hear her faint, melodic humming echoing from the floor below. My eyes filled with tears. Grief does strange things to your mind, making you crave the impossible. Before I could even think about what I was doing, I stood up, opened my bedroom door, and stepped out into the dark, cold hallway. The warmth of the kitchen scent faded slightly as I walked down the corridor, replaced by the reality of the chilly house. That's when I saw my dad at the end of the hallway, pulling on his heavy winter coat. He's an ER doctor, and his phone had just gone off. The hospital needed him for an emergency incoming trauma. He looked absolutely exhausted, dead on his feet, with dark purple bags sagging beneath his eyes. He hadn't slept properly in days. For a split second, a wave of panic hit me and I wanted to beg him to stay. I didn't want to be left alone in the quiet. But before I could speak, he just stepped closer, kissed the top of my head, and whispered in a raspy, tired voice, "Keep an eye on your brother." Then he opened the front door and left. A few moments later, the low rumble of his car engine started up in the driveway, slowly pulling away and disappearing into the night. The sound faded into the distance, leaving the house feeling even emptier than before. I stood in the dim light for a moment before walking over to my twin brother's room. I pushed the door open just a few inches to check on him. He was fast asleep, buried under a mountain of blankets. His phone was resting on the nightstand, softly playing one of those ambient rain and forest tracks he always used to drown out the silence when he couldn't sleep. The gentle patter of digital rain filled his room. Comforted that he was resting, I quietly closed his door. Then I froze. Further down the hall, my parents' bedroom door was cracked open just a few inches. The interior of their room was pitch black. But as I stared into the gap, my stomach dropped. In the darkness, I thought I saw the outline of someone standing perfectly still, right behind the door, watching me through the narrow opening. I couldn't see a face. I couldn't make out a body or tell if it was a man or a woman. But every instinct in my body screamed that someone was in there, hiding in the shadows, staring directly at me. My throat went completely dry and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Trying to shake off the paralyzing fear, I reached out with a trembling hand, found the hallway light switch and flicked it. The space flooded with harsh, yellow light. Nothing. The doorway was entirely empty. I stood there for a few agonizing seconds, my heart hammering against my ribs before forcing my feet to move. I walked down the hall and pushed the door all the way open, stepping into my parents' room. Everything looked perfectly normal. The bed was neatly made, the dresser was untouched, and the family photos still hung peacefully on the wall. To clear my head and ground myself, I walked over and opened my mom's closet. The moment the doors slid back, the familiar, heavy scent of her perfume washed over me. It completely broke my composure. The sheer weight of losing her crashed down all at once. I buried my face in her hanging dresses and just started crying, sobbing silently into the fabric. I don't know how long I stood there like that. It could have been a minute, it could have been 10. But as I shifted my weight, my elbow hit something solid in the deep back corner of the closet. I pulled back, wiping my eyes, and reached behind a row of heavy winter coats. My fingers brushed against a cold, leather box. I pulled it out into the dim light of the bedroom. It was locked with a small brass latch. Normally, I wouldn't have messed with my parents' private belongings, but I'd spent part of my early teenage years being a very different, rebellious person than the golden daughter my parents thought they knew. I knew how to pick a basic lock. I pulled a metal hairpin from my hair, straightened it out, and inserted it into the mechanism. After about 3 minutes of tense fumbling, a sharp click echoed through the quiet room. The lock popped open. The moment I lifted the heavy leather lid, an unnatural chill seemed to hit the room, making me shiver. Inside the box lay a strange assortment of items. First was a heavily damaged stone statue, its facial features so completely worn away by time or deliberate scraping that I couldn't even tell what it was supposed to represent. There was something deeply unsettling about its blank, featureless face. Next to it were 2 old baby binkies and a faded photograph of my twin brother and me as infants in our crib. But underneath everything else, resting at the very bottom of the box, was an unlabeled VHS tape. No writing, no dates, nothing. Driven by an intense, nervous curiosity, I carried the tape downstairs to the living room, where we still kept an old, bulky TV with a built-in VCR player. The machine hissed loudly as I pushed the tape into the slot. The screen crackled with loud, gray static before the tracking adjusted and an image flickered onto the screen. The footage was shot from a first-person perspective. It was my mom holding the camera. She was walking through our house at night, quietly humming a pleasant tune to herself. She sounded happy, completely normal. The camera panned down the familiar hallway until she reached her bedroom door and pushed it open. My dad was fast asleep on his side. Mom walked right up to the edge of the bed, gently kissed his forehead and whispered, "Sleep well, my dear husband." She watched him sleep for a few seconds before quietly backing out and leaving the room. The camera turned back toward the hallway, moving with a slow, deliberate pace toward the nursery. The nursery door creaked open. Inside the dark room, there was a single large wooden crib where my twin brother and I slept side by side as babies. Mom walked over and sat down right next to the railing, pointing the camera down at our tiny sleeping faces. Her free hand reached into the frame, gently pulling the blanket up to our chins. "My little angels," she whispered softly into the microphone. "You are so beautiful." She watched us sleep for a long moment. Then, her voice shifted into a low, rhythmic melody, and she began to sing a lullaby I had never heard before. "Sleep now, the evening's here and shadows fill the room. Pan walks softly by your bed beneath the silver moon. The night whispers sweet to a mother's desire, while Pan plays his pipe by a flickering fire. Little ones, don't be afraid, his tall horn watches tight. Pan's crimson eye guards your dreams until the morning light. Sleep now, for the wind has come to steal the candles bright." She stopped singing. The audio captured the sound of her gentle breathing as she reached down and stroked my infant cheek with her thumb. Then, slowly, the camera tilted upward, looking past the lens into the deep shadows behind the crib. "Thank you, Pan," she whispered. A strange, freezing wave of unease crept over me. I sat frozen on the living room floor, wondering who or what Pan was supposed to be. Suddenly, the audio on the tape went dead silent. The humming stopped. The ambient room noise cut out completely. A few seconds passed on the silent footage. And then, from the pitch-black shadow directly behind the baby crib, a hand slowly reached out into the frame. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a human hand. It was massive, covered in thick, matted dark hair, ending in long, unnaturally elongated fingers with sharp, blackened nails. The grotesque hand slowly descended into the crib, its coarse fingers lightly brushing across my infant brother's tiny, fragile hand. I let out a choked gasp, knocking my chair completely over as I leaped to my feet in pure horror. In a panic, I lunged forward at the television and slammed my palm against the main power button. The screen snapped off. The static vanished. The living room plunged into total, absolute silence. I stood there in the dark, breathing incredibly hard, my chest heaving as my eyes tried to adjust to the sudden lack of light. I stared blankly at my own faint reflection in the dark, glossy glass of the TV screen. And that's when I saw it. Reflected in the glass, standing just a few feet directly behind me in the center of the living room, was a figure. Was my mom. She was just standing there, wearing her old, faded house dress, her hands neatly folded over her stomach. She was staring at the back of my head, wearing a soft, peaceful smile. It was the exact same comforting smile she used to give me whenever I woke up crying from a bad nightmare as a kid. I froze, completely paralyzed by a terror so profound I couldn't even scream. Then, right before my eyes in the reflection, her soft smile began to stretch. It grew wider and wider, unhinging past the point of what was humanly possible, pulling the skin taut against her cheeks, revealing too many teeth in the darkness. And for the very first time in my entire life, I wished with everything inside me that I hadn't seen my mother. My dad came home a few hours later, but I never told him about the tape or the box or what I saw in the reflection. I burned the VHS tape in the backyard the very next morning, watching the plastic melt into a toxic black sludge. But destroying the footage didn't fix anything. It's been months since the funeral, and my brother and I have moved out into our own separate apartments, but the heavy silence has never truly left me. Every night, right before I drift off to sleep, I swear I can smell a faint hint of warm walnut and honey in the air. And when I close my eyes, I can still hear her voice humming in the dark, leaving me with the terrifying certainty that whatever she invited into our home all those years ago is still watching us.